Okay, thank you for joining us, Governor. Now you stand apart from your party on some key issues, one of which being gun control, and I want to tell you about recent, news in relation to gun control. But when you were governor of New York, you passed some pretty comprehensive legislation, and in fact was kind of the strongest in the country at the time. Do you see a pathway forward for any of that kind of legislation that you passed in New York?
I think in other states, for sure. I think the most important element of that was to make sure that even private gun shows or private shows had to have a background check before they could complete a sale. I think it's now 13 or 14 states that have done that. And I think there's enormous public support for it. I think it makes tremendous sense. You don't want someone who is a criminal, mentally ill, on a terrorist watch list to be able to go buy a gun simply because it's a private show. And I would hope that other states would take a look at it and say this is the right thing to do.
Okay, so, you see it as a state issue?
I do. I'm a great believer in the 10th Amendment, that unless powers are granted to the federal government, they're left to the states and the people.
Was the political divide within your state really any different than we're seeing in our country, which is essentially leading to a stalemate? There can't be much gun legislation.
We didn't have a stalemate because one of the things I've always been able to do, or always worked hard to do, is bring people together on common sense solutions. It's one of the reasons I'm running for president, is we see a government in a country now where we face enormous challenges, but the Republicans and the Democrats don't even seem to talk to each other, let alone sit down and try to find common ground. And as governor, that's what I did on so many issues. Issues that in the past would have divided Republicans and Democrats, like welfare reform. I actually got a very Democratic House to support my measures to put in place mandatory workfare and time limits. But I got Republicans to agree to expanding access to health care for low-income workers who could take that job without being trapped in a family that doesn't have health care if their kid gets sick. So I think that's what we need in Washington, a leader who's going to sit down with both sides and try to find common ground. And perhaps in a primary you should be hyper partisan, and I'm proud to be a limited government conservative Republican. But I think one of the things most distressing to me with President Obama is he hasn't tried, in my view, seriously to sit down and create bipartisan solutions. And the next president has to, and I'm prepared to.
Was the deck already stacked against President Obama when he came in?
I don't think so. He had an overwhelmingly Democratic Congress. And yet, Obamacare being the classic example, not one Republican voted for it, although there were a great many Republicans who understood we needed to have stronger action to deal with the issue of the uninsured. But not when it was just in a partisan way, done, in my view, horribly, in a way that has hurt the healthcare system of this country and driven up rates and cost economic growth, when it could have been done far better. And I'm always asked, well, Republicans always say you could have done it better. I put in place programs to help the uninsured when I was governor of New York that used market-based solutions but government-supported policies that allowed us to provide health care insurance for hundreds of thousands of low-income and small business residents who before that didn't have access. So I think there were bipartisan solutions, but this president didn't try to accomplish them.
Now, there are certainly bipartisan elements within Obamacare.
Like what?
Well,
I mean, like the president gave the president gave lip service to saying, let's look at junk lawsuit reform, but they never even considered it. Give me an example. You may be right.
Well, the individual mandate, which
I think the individual mandate is horrible, and I wouldn't call that. I mean, I think it hasn't worked. The idea was that by forcing young, healthier people into the pool, you could provide greater coverage without driving up rates. The rates have gone up. The young, healthy have not signed up. They're paying the fines, and we're going to see over the next year or two that a great many people initially signed up don't continue in the program, whereas I did the exact opposite. My Healthy New York program, which I got through a overwhelmingly Democratic state assembly and had Republican support in the state Senate, created this program And instead of mandating that healthy young people, an entrepreneur, someone who works for a small business buy coverage, we made it so attractive they chose to buy it. And when I started it, it was government subsidized. We used tobacco revenue to reduce the costs. Within 7 or 8 months, we had so many healthy people sign up because it was a great program that we didn't have to subsidize it at all anymore. So I mean, the broader point, though, is that when you sit down and look to find common ground and solve problems, you're going to find that your ideas aren't always right. And someone, because they're from the other party's ideas, aren't always wrong. But if you don't have that dialogue, if you don't have that openness to being willing to listen to criticism or hear suggestions, it doesn't get done. And it hasn't gotten done, and I think that's a sad thing in Washington.
You were recently part of the No Labels conference. Where do you see, the future of bipartisan solution?
I see a bipartisan solution to the issue of greenhouse gas emissions. I honestly do. I think there's one thing, we should be able to agree on two things, Republicans and Democrats. Human activity is emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. And all things being equal, CO2 is a greenhouse gas that warms the atmosphere. I don't think there's any scientist that disputes that. You can dispute the degree or the balance between human activity or natural reasons, but you can't really dispute that. And I think Republicans and Democrats both want us to have cleaner, healthier air. Both want to see us have more domestic, clean sources of energy. And we can all agree that the greatness of America, in significant part, comes from our ingenuity, our innovation. And as I said at the No Labels conference, there's only one country in the world where where CO2 emissions are below 1995, and that's the U.S. Not because of a massive government tax or regulation or shutting down of industries, but because of a private sector innovation, fracking, that has allowed us to replace coal with natural gas. So what I would do, and I think you could get broad bipartisan support, is do things like make permanent and expand the R&D tax credit so we could have next generation solar. Reform the way the Energy Department and the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, operates so we could look at things like thorium reactors where there's no risk of meltdown, no waste at the end of the fuel cycle, and no military use. Things like this that will allow us to decarbonize our economy, decarbonize our atmosphere, and strengthen our economy. And the other point on this, where I think both sides can agree, today the United States only produces 16% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. If we were to cut ours in half, the world's greenhouse gas emissions would go up enormously because of what's happening in China, India, Malaysia, around the world. But if we develop technology like solar panels that have 50% efficiency, or a way to capture coal CO2 emissions and reutilize it for beneficial purposes, we not only dramatically create a more efficient economy here with cleaner, healthier air and lower greenhouse gas emissions, but we export that technology to China and to India and to those countries. So
we've seeded the manufacturing and even a lot of the engineering.
Well, manufacturing is another issue, and that's another one where you're absolutely right. Our manufacturing base has collapsed, and a month or so ago the stock market was rattled because of the value of the Chinese currency. We shouldn't be so dependent on that. We should make things in America again. We have the workforce. We have energy prices that are coming down. We have entrepreneurs. We have capital. But what we don't have is the right tax and regulatory climate to allow that to happen. And I'd make a lot of changes, but two I'd make is one is allow the immediate expensing of capital investment because productivity increases is where you get wage increases. And when we get companies investing in equipment and capital as opposed to stock buying of another company as a way to drive up their earnings, we're going to create better jobs in America. And the second would be to lower the tax on manufacturing to 12%. Right now, it's the highest in the developed world, the highest. I want to make it the lowest in the developed world so that the American entrepreneur can build a factory here and the American worker can have a job here. My grandfathers, neither one of them spoke English. They both went to work in a factory. And that's how you had the path to the middle class, because they were good paying jobs. When I was in college, Christmas and summer vacations, my cousin and I worked in that same factory, in the local factory, and we were so happy to have the jobs because they paid well compared to a service job. There's no reason in the 21st century we can't do that again. And by the way, when I was governor, I did that in upstate New York, and I could talk about our computer chip manufacturing factories from companies all over the world that right now, today, have, I think it's over 6,000 factory jobs in upstate New York manufacturing computer chips.
GE, right?
No, it's not GE. It was originally IBM working with AMD, and then it became Global Foundries. But we did a number of different projects working with the private sector. The key to that, and it's something I would do on clean energy, is what we did is we said we want to be the world's most advanced center for nanotechnology research. So I went and challenged the private sector, the university, and the not-for-profit sector, saying the state will put up $250,000 in pure capital to build a shared research facility, but only if the private sector, university sector, and think tanks come together and match us 3-to-1. To make a long story short, today there is over $20 billion in capital invested in the most advanced nano research facility in the world. Every major global company is there, and it has spun off the factories, which is exactly what the goal was when we announced this. So there are solutions, and I think that's the point. And we just haven't had a government that has been open-minded enough or visionary enough to achieve those solutions. Oh, and by the way, immediate expensing of capital investment, things like a solar farm or a wind farm, it would significantly allow them to be more competitive because of that tax provision. Without creating winners or losers, you allow every investment in capital to be able to do that.
I know you're also opposed to Common Core, seen as a big-time federal overreach.
Yes.
Should the federal government have any role in making sure kids in Louisiana are learning the same thing that kids in New Hampshire are learning?
You know, no. I mean, it always gets me that, oh, we have confidence in our state, but that's a bad state. And the people there don't think so, apparently, or they would have voted for a different government if the case was made. There is a role for the federal government, but I think it's more in sharing information, best practices, things of that nature. Pointing out if State X is having enormous success, for example, in math, how they're doing it, and providing that information to other states. But for the federal education department to say, you should be doing it the way this state is doing it, or the way we tell you to do it, the idea that something like that can be run from Washington and not have significant political overtones, to me, is something that is just not credible. It may start off with the purest of intentions, but virtually everything in Washington at some point becomes politicized. And I don't think we should have a national government setting educational policy.
Well, Common Core doesn't say how you're supposed to teach.
I'm all for high standards.
It's the what?
I'm all for high standards. But what happened with No Child Left Behind was that was the original idea. And then all of a sudden, they came out with recommendations, and if the recommendations weren't followed, then you'd have to do certain other things. And just as an example, they had the provision that by 2014 in all these states that have students 100% proficient in math and reading and everything. But that hasn't happened. So what happens is you have, which is an admirable goal. But now Washington has the authority to grant a waiver from that. But you have to do education the way you want for the administration to allow you to have the waiver. And that's something where it just points out that something that appeared neutral, appeared well-intentioned, 100% proficiency, has turned into something where the federal government has power over states to decide if they can do this or they can do that. And it's not and it is the political class. And whether it's Republicans setting that policy or Democrats setting that policy, I don't think Washington should be doing it.
You spend quite a bit of time in state government. But now we seem to be at a place where questioning whether or not experience in politics is actually a good thing.
Yeah.
And
it's fascinating.
We can see that in the polls.
Yes. Yes.
I want to get your perspective on on whether or not there's any, if there's any accuracy in that?
I think your analysis is absolutely right. And I think it comes down to there's so much anger towards Washington that it's not working and things don't change. And that has converted into an enormous distrust of elected officials. I mean, particularly on the Republican side, the Republicans won the House in 2010, and then they went and run the Senate, and nothing's changed in the eyes of the Republicans. So it's easy to say, doesn't matter. They're all alike. The politicians will tell you they're going to do this and they're going to do that, but nothing changes. And there's a lot of reason to believe that's the case, because I think Washington has become an inside game with both parties, where they know that they're set for life once you get elected. If you don't get reelected or don't run, you can become a lobbyist or somehow peddle influence and never go back. And that's the case with both parties, and we have to reform that. And I could go on forever about that. But I understand the anger about politicians because they say things and it doesn't happen. And one of the reasons I'm still optimistic about this race is my record. I said we were going to reform the welfare system, and we had over 1 million few people when I left. I said we were going to change the criminal justice system when we went from the most dangerous state to the 4th safest state. I said we were going to turn deficits into surpluses and cut taxes, and we cut taxes by $143 billion, more than the other 49 states combined, and had our highest credit rating in a generation, and billions in surplus. And I did it with a Democratic Assembly that most of the time had 103 Democrats and 47 Republicans. So part of why I'm running is when I say that I want to create the incentives and initiatives for us to have market-driven clean energy solutions that allow us to grow the economy, have cleaner air, and deal with the issue of greenhouse gases, I know I can do it. When I say that I want to shrink the size and the power of Washington over our lives, I know I can do it. And you contrast that to Washington today, whereas, just as an example, the Republicans all ran saying we're going to repeal Obamacare, control both houses of the legislature, and haven't even been able to get a bill to the president's desk for him to veto. We know he'll veto it, but they haven't even been able to do that. So the Republican voters go, forget politicians. They can't get anything done. We're going to look for an outsider. What I hope is that they say, well, they haven't been able to get something done. Let's look for someone who has been able to get something done, and who actually knows government and knows how to run a difficult, complex government. And to do that, you have to be willing to work across party lines. You have to be willing to compromise. And again, is that the right thing to say in a primary? It is if you want to be honest with the people. Because the last Republican president who Republicans idolized was Ronald Reagan, and he had Tip O'Neill and a Democratic House. But he didn't throw up his hands, or he didn't say, I'm going to do it by executive order. He sat down, worked hard. They fought, O'Neill and Reagan, all the time, but ultimately things got done. And I know I have the ability to do that.
Any frustrations from your point of view? I mean, looking at the polls, certainly not among you.
The only frustration really is, the reaction I get from people where I go is tremendous. It's very encouraging. The only frustration is it's hard to get the media attention, because I think CNN has done something like 3,500 feature stories on Donald Trump, but you can't worry about the things you can't control. If you believe in your ability to lead, believe in the need to change the direction of government, you fight the fight.
You touched briefly on criminal justice reform, and that seems like another area that some bipartisanship is really possible.
Absolutely.
How do you think that'll play out? What do you think it'll look like?
I think there is enormous opportunity for bipartisanship. And I'll just give you an example. When I was governor, we changed the criminal justice system from top to bottom. But there was enormous pressure on the drug laws, the old called Rockefeller drug laws, that had very strict sentencing for first violations and had taken away judicial discretion. So what I want to do is be tough on crime, but be smart. So I sat down, again, with the Republicans in the Senate and the Democrats in the House, and we had very long, difficult negotiations. I wanted tougher penalties for kingpins. I wanted tougher penalties for drug dealers who had a weapon, had a gun with them. They wanted to reduce the mandatory sentences. And to make a long story short, we came up with a tremendous package where if you were a young kid selling drugs on the street, got caught, it's a felony. You'd be arrested, convicted of a felony, but instead of sending you to jail, we would send you to a camp, shock incarceration camps, where they would have 4 months, 6 months of, it was like boot camp, where you get counseling, you get up in the morning, you have physical, educational, rehab, and if you completed that program, you didn't go. You never went to the prison correctional system. You were released under supervision. But on the other hand, we did get tougher penalties for the kingpins. And I'll never forget just one example. We had all-night sessions all the time battling, because it wasn't, it's not like this was easy. And I remember I'm arguing with the state assembly, and it's like midnight, and they're going, we need this, and I'm going, if you're a drug dealer with a gun, it's a different category altogether. I want tougher penalties. And they say, well, we can't do that. The big guy leading the fight for the drug reforms was Russell Simmons, the rap impresario. So I said, let's get Russell Simmons on the phone. I called him, and I said, get up to Albany. This is literally true. He cared enough about this that he got there around 3 in the morning. And we kept going. And finally, around 5 o'clock, I'm going, well, we can do this. We want to have the alternatives to incarceration, shock camps as opposed to prison. But we also want this. And they're going, no, it's ridiculous to have a tougher penalty for a dealer who gets caught with a gun. And Russell Simmons looks at the Speaker's counsel and goes, I don't want people with guns selling drugs in my neighborhood. He's absolutely right. And at which point they caved. And we were able to pass this comprehensive drug law reform. But it takes effort, it takes open-mindedness, it takes leadership, but you can do it. And I think there's a long-winded answer to your very short question, but yes, I think the drug laws in Washington and the other laws are something where you can find common ground. We want to be tougher when it's appropriate, but we want to be smarter when it has the chance of turning someone's life around without trapping them in a correctional system forever.
How'd you pay for that?
Actually, it was less expensive because the camps were less expensive than jail. And what was interesting is we changed for example, we had tougher sentences for violent crimes, and I ended parole for violent felons. And they were going, oh, this is going to ruin the prison system, it's going to be overcrowded. When I first took office, the prison system went up. The last 3 years, we had a dramatic decline in the population in our jails. Because what our study showed is that when someone committed a violent felony, and before I took office, there was revolving door justice. Literally, they'd be out in the street. They could be out the same day, even if they were convicted, or they'd be out so quickly. And we did an analysis that when a convicted felon was released, violent felon, onto the street and was arrested again, they had on average committed 12 violent felonies between the time they were released and the time they were recharged. So that by ending that revolving door justice and keeping the hardcore violent criminals in there for a longer time, we had the population go down. And we also had a lower rate of recidivism when I left. So that use intelligence as opposed to polls or sound bites, and you can find common ground and change dramatically people's lives in the direction of a state.
Curious how you see the situation in the House unfolding. There's Boehner stepping down, McCarthy doesn't want the job, and it could unfold a lot of different ways. I'm curious to see how you think it ought to unfold.
I thank God I've never been held public office in Washington. It's like a world apart, and I would no longer suggest who they should elect or how they should elect them than I not brush my teeth in the morning. It's just not something I want to get mired in. But I understand the dissatisfaction with the House leadership and the Senate Republican leadership, because there is this sense that nothing gets done and nothing changes. So we'll see what happens, but I don't think it reflects a meltdown in the Republican Party or a collapse in a sense that we have to be able to govern. I think it's more just enormous frustration at the inability to achieve things. And certainly the congressional leadership deserves some of the blame for that, but I also think that President Obama does, because when he essentially writes Congress out of the picture and says, well, the heck with Congress, I have a pen and a phone, and I can do things by executive order, and things that I think were illegal, like unilaterally changing provisions of Obamacare, putting a date off by a year. I think it has created that sense that Congress doesn't matter that much. So unless you have a sense that you have a real purpose and function, and it matters what you do, you start being more angry than productive.
Just wanted to shift over to foreign policy for a
Sure.
bit. So everyone's talking about Russia, so I'm just curious how you see, I don't know, everything playing out. What would you do with to face off with Putin right now? Are you in the Fiorina camp where you don't talk to him, or are you?
No, it's very interesting. I don't think at this point you talk to him. I think at some point you do. I think Putin is, for all the bravado, in a very weak position. The Russian economy is in dire straits. 50% of their budget is oil revenue and oil or gas revenue, and it has plummeted. So they have massive holes in their budget. The ruble has lost over 20%. The average Russian standard of living is plummeting, and they have inflation of 17%. And Putin's strength has been the pensioners. But when they get a 17% hike in their cost of living and the government doesn't have the money to match that, he domestically is in a weak position. He's popular because when things fall apart, nationalism is the last refuge of scoundrels. And between Crimea and Ukraine and now Syria, he has rallied them around the greatness of Russia. But ultimately, I don't think that's going to succeed. So I would ratchet up pressure on Russia. I would provide military assistance to the Ukrainian army. I don't want to go to war with Russia, but they've been begging for it for years. I would, in Syria, I would look to ratchet up sanctions, assuming we could get the EU to go with it, because they have hurt Russia, the collapse of the ruble. And it's not just Ukraine, Syria, it's also that they have now created a very clear strategic alliance with Iran. And Iran, by the way, is constantly breaking the provisions of sanctions that still exist, like the launching of a long-range missile on Sunday, violating every agreement that they are subject to, and yet we look the other way, and Russia empowers them to do that. In Syria, I think we have an opportunity there, as strange as it sounds, because Turkey for 3 years has been calling for a no-fly zone along the Turkish border with the Sunni, in the Sunni anti-Assad areas that, in my view, made enormous sense then and could make enormous sense now. Turkey has not been, even though they're in NATO, a friend of ours. They've allowed basic free passage for people to ISIS. They have allowed ISIS to sell its oil through Turkey and get revenue and other equipment through Turkey. But they are very anti-Assad, and they are very worried about Iranian presence. Today, 1,500 Iranian troops going in, not just supporting Hezbollah and others, but actual Iranian troops to work with the Russians. And it gives us a chance to reform a closer bond with Turkey, which is the other major regional power. So I would sit down, and the West has called, France leading, has called for that no-fly zone along the Syrian border in the West, where the Sunni, so-called moderate Sunnis still control areas. And if Turkey were willing to do that, I would do that. And I would just go to the Russians. I wouldn't sit down and negotiate. I'd say, we are creating this no-fly zone. We are going to be flying there. You are not going to be flying there. And I have very little doubt that Putin would back down. I mean, it's bravado, it's nationalism, but I can't see him looking to escalate that in any way. And so I think, particularly if we had Turkey, as well as our other Middle Eastern allies, to the extent they still trust us, and Europe behind us, and I think we would.
To what extent would it be somebody else's responsibility to really enforce a no-fly zone? And of course, I'm talking about U.S. bearing the sole responsibility.
It wouldn't be the U.S.'s sole responsibility. The Turks have been calling for this and want to be very involved, and the Turks are militarily not inconsequential. And Hollande and France and others in the West have been calling and saying, we need to do this. And it is Europe that is reaping the whirlwind of the millions of refugees. Whereas if there were a place in Syria where Syrian refugees didn't have to flee that country and they knew they could be safe pending the outcome of the catastrophe there, I think would have a profound impact in reducing the number of refugees as well. So life is not without risk. I think when you are weak, draw lines in the sand or red lines and then don't stand behind them. When you say time and again there will be serious consequences and nothing happens, that's when we are at greatest risk, because those who want to challenge us will continue to push and continue to push every day. Today, the Iranian troops going into Syria. If we say this is our line and this is not something we're going to claim we never did, this is where we will be, and we will have Turkey, we will have Middle Eastern countries, we will have Muslim and Arab countries, and we will have a united West saying stay out. I think the best way to have peace is through strength, not through weakness.
You mentioned Iran, and one of the things that I think is interesting in the point we are in relations there is that there seems to be a lot of almost pro-Western feelings with the youth in that country.
With the people.
So we have a real
Absolutely.
opportunity there too. So how
We
do you
did.
balance showing strength but also building for the future?
Yeah, I think the Iranian deal was a disaster. We had a golden opportunity, just as Russia's budget and a lot of their economy has collapsed with the price of oil. The Iranian sanctions were working. They were working extremely well. And that was with oil at $100 a barrel. The sanctions were working well. And I think you saw back in, when was it, 2009, the Green Revolution, I think it was, where the Iranian youth almost overthrew the Ayatollahs, the mullahs, and created a, for lack of a better term, more Western-oriented government. But now we have empowered Khamenei and his people. And look what's happened. The idea was perhaps Iran can be wooed back into the community of nations and act respectfully. Once that deal was done, before the ink was signed, Soleimani went to Russia against UN sanctions, saying he's not allowed to leave the country. They didn't go to buy caviar. They went to buy weapons and equipment in violation of existing sanctions. They convicted the AP or Washington Post reporter on ridiculously bogus charges. Khamenei, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, forbade any negotiations or discussions with the United States government officials. And now they're actually sending troops into Syria. So it was all, you know, this, we're going to give them $150 billion when we know they are a terrorist regime, supporting terror around the globe, and not just in the Middle East, everywhere from Argentina to Venezuela as well, in exchange for the hope that perhaps they will join the community of nations. Well, first of all, the hope has been dashed, if you look at this at all realistically. And second of all, they have already violated the agreement by Rouhani going there, by buying weapons. They're not supposed to buy weapons for 8 years. By testing a long-range missile. They're not supposed to do that. They have already violated over and over again the terms of what they said they would be willing to do. So what makes us think that they're going to buy by any of them once they get this $100 billion plus of economic relief? I understand it is very important to draw a distinction between the governing class and the people. And to the extent we are more proactive in seeking to isolate Iran and prevent it from getting nuclear weapons or supporting global terror, we have to make sure that we are going against the rulers and not the people, because I'm by nature an optimist. And I think that, again, we show strength, but not arrogance. Strength, but at the same time appealing to the Iranian people, that there is hope that they will have, not immediately, but over time, the impact to correct the course of that country. I mean, Rouhani, who got elected after, what's his name, the crazy guy, Ahmadinejad, had the hope of being more oriented towards human rights and the rule of law. The problem is he doesn't control the country. He's dictated to from above. But I'm a believer that that can change, and that can change from Iran.
So, a lot of people in this country have lamented the growing divide, the growing income gap, the growing wealth gap. What does that say about Americans, and is this good for our country to have that growing divide between the two classes and a shrinking middle class?
The backbone of American values and of our economy and of our society has been having a very strong middle class. And they are not getting the jobs, they are not getting the income growth, they are not having a sense of confidence that we need to have in America. I don't think the solution is, no, the solution is not demonizing the successful. I mean, the place where the income divide has grown the most over the last decade is China, because everybody was even. When they were all broke, now you have Chinese billionaires, but 600 million people have moved to the middle class. So you look and say, oh my God, China's wealth divide or economic divide has grown by leaps and bounds, but so has a healthy middle class. So I don't think you don't solve the problem by demonizing the successful. You solve the problem by empowering middle class growth. And one is jobs. And I talked about how we should make things in this country again. Manufacturing jobs are good jobs. And just as an example, I walked the factory of one of the computer chip floor, one of the factories in upstate New York, and was talking to the guy. The programmers, the software programmers would get $45,000 to $65,000. The carpenters, electricians, plumbers, steam fitters got anywhere from $80,000 to $120,000 a year. Great jobs. Blue-collar manufacturing jobs. So first we have to create an economic climate where we create those jobs. And there's no question in my mind we can. The second area, not just manufacturing, but a small business. That's where the bulk of job growth in America comes from. Last year was the first time in 32 years where we had fewer businesses than at the beginning. The regulatory and tax burden, including Obamacare, placed on small businesses is so high that a lot of people say, hey, I have a great idea. I want to go work in my garage. I want to set up a shop on the corner. And they look at the red tape and the fees, and they give up they throw up their hands and say it's just too complicated and expensive. So small business, manufacturing, create those middle class jobs, and certainly tax reform and throwing out the ridiculous tax code and getting rid of the exemptions and loopholes and credits that benefit the influential and the wealthy. Those should go. Instead of, and I don't mean to criticize him because he followed the law, but Mitt Romney made millions of dollars and paid 12%. I would get rid of all the loopholes and exemptions and everything, but have a top rate of 24%. He would have paid twice as much. And the rhetoric from the left is that, oh, it's a tax break for the rich. No, we're going to get rid of the loopholes and exemptions and use those funds to lower the rates for everybody, so those who were benefiting from that would pay more. And I've had this debate with some liberals, and I'd end up, wealthy, successful New York liberals. And I go, do you get a W-2? Or 1099, they laugh and say, no, of course not. I go, what rate tax did you pay last year? And they just laugh. Because there's no way they come close to paying the top income tax rates because they don't get, either they have exemptions or credits or something. And those total $1.4 trillion a year, trillion, of exemptions, credits, loopholes, carve-outs in Washington. And the Bowles-Simpson Commission, a great bipartisan starting point for rationalizing how Washington functions. I don't agree with significant parts of it, but the starting point was to throw out all those exemptions and credits and loopholes and lower the rates. I think they're exactly right. So I forget what the question was, but I'm on. It was, the middle class. The other thing is there's a skills gap. We need to elevate the skills of the American worker. And there's no question, I mean, like in construction now, actually you asked, the NFIB just did a survey of its small business members. What are the biggest impediments to your growth in hiring people? First was taxes, second was regulation, and the third was finding qualified workers. So we need to have a better educational system, not through Washington telling people how to educate them, but by creating programs that incentivize states and localities to have improved education, and we need to upgrade skills, using things like community colleges. And one of the things we did, again, in upstate New York was we created programs where if you had a large employer in a county, and you had a community college and they needed a certain skill level, the community college would work with them to offer programs for their students so that they would come out trained. The students didn't have to take them. They could study anything they want, but they knew that if they went into this space, they would virtually have a guaranteed job at the end. And the employer would have qualified workers to do what needs to be done. So grow the middle class, invest in productivity, which raises wages, create more jobs, raise the skill level of our workforce, make things in America again, empower small businesses, and I have no doubt that, sure, the wealthy would continue to do well, although if we got rid of their exemptions and credits and loopholes, they would have to pay a fairer share in taxes at a lower rate, and we'd have a far more stable, longer-term view of society.
Just a quick question about the 24% tax rate that was on the top. Would you see other brackets lower?
Yes. Other brackets would be lowered too. We've actually outlined a plan, and we're getting it scored because unlike Donald Trump, where it's a great program, and afterwards some of them are saying, well, it's only costing $12 trillion a year. It's going to be interesting to see how it's paid for. I don't want to have a plan that is unworkable. I want to have a plan where you can sit down and say, this is the right way to go.
And you're confident that closing the loophole would pay for that pretty enormous difference?
No, I don't know that closing the loophole would pay for all of it. It would pay for a significant part of it because we keep some of the exemptions. But the other thing I would do is reduce the size of the federal workforce. And Bowles-Simpson called just two other things on the cost side. There's the revenue side and there's the cost side, expenditure side. Two reforms that Bowles-Simpson recommended was reducing the size of the federal workforce by 10%. I think you can do more than that. Because when I was governor of New York, I reduced the size of the workforce by over 15%. And we had virtually no layoffs, and we had a far more efficient government. And the second is in the entitlement programs. It's just as one example. They recommended block granting Medicaid to the states and reducing the total amount of that grant by 10%. Having been governor, and Medicaid was our single biggest expenditure, I have no doubt that would have worked great. Because right now, Washington runs Medicaid programs for states from South Dakota to California to New York. And the needs and the markets and the entire system varies greatly from state to state. So it's not just the revenue side. And the program I outlined would probably end up reducing taxes in the short term, although I think we'd have economic growth that would largely offset that. But we would reduce costs as well to move towards a balanced budget.
Military spending?
No, I honestly believe that we are living in the most dangerous climate since the end of the Cold War. Between radical Islam and an assertive, aggressive Russia, China being far more aggressive in places like the South China Sea, this is not the time for us to reduce our military to pre-World War II size. I want to see us strengthen and rebuild our military, not so we can use it, but so that we don't have to use it. Restraint in the use of the military is absolutely critical. You only use it when it's absolutely necessary. I mean, I have two sons, both of them after college. One went into the Marines and served a year in Iraq. One after college went into the 10th Mountain Division and got back from Afghanistan in September. So I know what it's like to worry when you get a phone call on the 2 in the morning and your kid is in harm's way, and I don't want to see one American placed in that position unless it's absolutely necessary. But to the extent we have a stronger military, better trained military, and draw clear lines and show that we are strong and going to stay strong, I think it's less likely we would need to utilize American forces.
You mentioned the South China Sea. I was wondering if you could talk a little more about that. That tension is really mounting there, and I'm just wondering, what you think about the freedom of navigation.
It's absolutely critical. First of all, it's blatantly illegal to create artificial islands, and it's completely in violation of international law to create this 9-dash line that claims, based on artificial created islands, that these are all Chinese territorial waters. Actually, the Philippines has taken them to the World Court, I believe in Brussels, challenging them, and China's poo-pooing the challenge but because I believe the Philippines are going to win, then it becomes a question of, does the global community stand behind what has been recognized as international law since World War II? There's going to be apparently a confrontation in the next week or two where American Navy ships are going to sail through those contested waters. I think we have to do that. To just say that we will look the other way, well, a major tenet of international law governing freedom of the seas is trashed, is wrong. I do not want to see confrontation with China. I don't think China wants to see confrontation with us. But there comes a point where if you don't show resolve, you're just going to continue to face greater and greater challenges. So the best solution to that would be if China would recognize the decision of the World Court, as the Philippines has said it would. But in the absence of that, we have got to uphold our right and the world's right to access of the South China Sea.
So does that mean you're comfortable with the way, maybe that's the wrong word, but the way Obama's handling the situation?
I don't know the answer because I don't know what communications and negotiations or diplomatic talks have been going on. I mean, obviously, talking is better than acting. But there comes a point where if that is insufficient, you have to act. So I don't know that we have exhausted all diplomatic opportunities. I assume we have, and if that's the case, then yes, I do believe the Obama administration is doing the right thing and asserting our right of free passage in navigable waters.
Do you believe police ought to wear body cameras?
I think it should be a decision made by the state and police forces, local police forces, not by the federal government. Mm-hmm. By the way,
do you support the call for police
you know,
to wear body cameras?
I understand the reason for it, and we have seen some horrific incidents, some which were just blown up wrongly, in my view, like Ferguson, and the idea that the Attorney General went there to someone who his own investigation a year later found was a criminal who didn't have his hands up, and the police officer was appropriate in defending himself and acting. I think that was outrageous. On the other hand, we saw the North Charleston shooting, which was just abhorrent. And whether or not, if it turns out, one of the reasons I'm a great believer in the 10th Amendment is because states should be the laboratories of democracy. So if a local department or a state tries this out and it proves to be enormously successful in reducing unnecessary violence, then other states will follow. If it doesn't, then if there are unintended consequences we're unaware of, then you'll see it and say, okay, well, they tried it. I'm not happy with how it worked out. So, you know, it's something where your initial reaction is say, yeah, let's try it, because you don't see the downside, or at least I don't see the downside, but you never know. So that's why I think local and state initiatives allow us to see if there were, in fact, unintended consequences that could hurt.
Any other questions?
Actually, I have one.
Come on, I'm a Jets fan. If you want to get really angry at me.
Are you a
here.
Mets fan?
I do like the Mets. I do like the Mets.
Okay.
I'm rooting tonight. Yes. Well, I'm happy about the Mets. And the Cubs. You know, I'm not a Cubs fan, but after 178 years or whatever it is, how can you not be happy the Cubs won a playoff?
I do have one other question for you. It was asked in the Democrats' debate, and I just wondering your thoughts on it. The question was, is Snowden a hero or a traitor?
He's a traitor. No question in my mind. No, he put American lives in jeopardy, may have cost the lives of either Americans or those working for our government, and has done enormous damage to our national security.
But what about what it revealed about,
I was troubled by what it revealed, but there are procedures by which you could do that without leaking it and then fleeing and going to Russia and still being in Russia. I think he is a traitor, a criminal who has damaged American security enormously.
Have you ever been to New Hartford, New York?
Yes, I have.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that area is like.
It's actually a relatively affluent area. I saw the horrible story about the parents beating their son to death, and it's just awful. It's a suburb of Utica in the Mohawk Valley in Oneida County. And it's a very nice community. It's not a upstate New York, with the exception of certain pockets like Albany and Ithaca. Corning and others is not particularly doing well. In fact, it's doing relatively poorly. But that's not that's a relatively solid economic community, and it's clearly not just a tragedy but a crime what happened there. But yeah, I was stunned because it's not the type of thing you would expect.
All right.
That's it? All right. Well, thank you. Nah, not yet. I got a couple more. Thank you for putting in Nancy Stiles and John Regan's op-ed. That is very good of you.
Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Good to see you. Good to meet you. Thank you. Okay.